Hi, I'm Jenny Walterman. This is my summary review of Module 14 case study on when ethics and policies collide. The summary of facts of the parties involved is that Richard is an assistant principal, first year from Southside. He has focused on a group of troubled students that are also from Southside, in particular James, who seems to be the ringleader. He's large, he's tough, he's described as having many tattoos. He's a 15-year-old. The other student involved is David, a 13-year-old, who's described as being smaller. He's an honor student, an academic, and involved in the band. And then the director of secondary education, who is Richard's boss, and is telling Richard to enforce established policies in regards to disciplining both boys the same, and is requiring Richard to follow through or face professional reprimand that will go in his personnel file if he does not. So the report of events, Richard is calling James to discuss recent tardy uptick in his attendance. And after calling him out to come to the office, a teacher then reports witnessing suspicious hallway activity between James and David, where James has passed David something, but she can't see what it is. She suspects that it's drugs, but can't be certain. So James arrives to the office prior to David, and Richard is trying to decide what to do about the situation, and decides to have the school resource officer escort David down to the office. He then interviews both students together in the same room with the officer present, and when asked about what was passed, David is visibly shaken but does not volunteer any information. This results in a search of David where brass knuckles are found, and both boys are subsequently arrested by the officer for having a weapon on school grounds and the possession of brass knuckles, which is a federal offense. James immediately speaks up, admits his responsibility in the situation, trying to absolve David, essentially saying, hey, those are mine. I brought them. I was going to use them later today to take care of some, quote, business. And then says that he threatened David, essentially telling him that he would hurt him if he didn't hold on to it for the rest of the day. And so when the consequence of bringing a weapon to school is discussed, it's an expulsion and 45 days at the alt ed school during that expulsion time prior to returning back to school. James is virtually unaffected by this sentence or this consequence decision. He's been there before. It's nothing new for him. And upon contacting his mother, James's mother, Richard says that the mother decides to let him stay in the juvenile detention center for a couple of days so that he can think about what he's done. David, on the other hand, starts crying. He's obviously stressed, visibly shaken, very upset by the situation. His mother, upon being contacted, immediately follows up with the juvenile detention center. I think it's important to mention that Richard observed that the mother was not aware of the zero tolerance policy, regardless of, who the student is, and we'll discuss that more in a little bit. The legal issues that I see involve the SRO's search and involvement in the investigation with all three in the room together. I know it's perfectly within the rights of the district to search and question a student. However, I wonder if all three of them should be in the same room together. James, the 15-year-old, the legal issues for him is that he did in fact bring a weapon to school. He had an intent to use it to cause harm to another student, and he also intimidated another student bullying. So a couple of different things going on there with James. David did in fact conceal a weapon. When he was questioned about it, he did not offer up any information in his defense or try to make a situation better by telling the truth. He chose to stay silent, which is an interesting sticking point for me. He could have made things better for himself, but chose not to, and we don't really know why at this point. It could be just because of the bully situation that he did not want to speak up with James in the room when he was initially questioned. And then legal issue for the director of secondary ed. She is facing a situation where Richard decided not to expel David and fill out the paperwork and send him to the alternate ed school for 45 days. However, he did send James. And so the director is saying that he needs to establish and enforce the district policies that are already in place, and that he needs to expel David and send him to the alt ed school for 45 days. And Richard is refusing to do this, saying that, he doesn't feel like it's right. And the director of secondary ed is looking at potential lawsuits for, discriminatory behavior towards one student versus another when they're both found in the wrong for bringing weapons to school. Ethical issues that I see involve Richard with involving the SRO officer in the same room with both students at the onset of the investigation, rather than separating them out and discussing with them individually the situation. Another ethical issue for Richard is refusing to follow the school policy and refusing to send David to the alt ed school when that was the established policies of the district. David's ethical issues are that he didn't really report that he had a weapon in his possession. He didn't report any kind of bullying or intimidation, but also he didn't have any prior offenses. So we're kind of looking at some ethical gray areas there of why didn't he tell the truth when he was questioned, and upon being searched, they found a weapon on him. The SRO officer, this is an example of positive ethical decision making where he treats both students the same, regardless of their historical context or what part of town they live in or what clubs or activities they're involved in the school building. They both were involved in a weapon on school grounds, and they both were treated the same. The ethical issues for the school policy is a zero tolerance policy that has no leniency or give for unique situations. Is that in the best interest of students? Is alt ed programming appropriate for first-time student offenders? And then not allowing room for individual student assessment and consequences related to that. Is that an ethical issue also? My synthesis statement is as follows. This is a case study that explores the legal and ethical actions and reactions of an assistant principal to very different students in the school district's zero tolerance policy. So my synthesis of facts involves people, a place, and a program. So the people listed that I spoke about earlier is Richard, the assistant principal, the reporting teacher, the SRO, James and David, the students, the director of secondary ed, Richard's boss, and the mothers of both James and David. This took place in a school hallway, and then the interrogation was held in the assistant principal's office. And then the programming for this is at a public school, a junior high school, and there's an alt ed facility available in the district. And there are established district policies for the programming, but there's also no mention of any SPED or behavior plan that needs to be considered when evaluating this situation. So if I'm reviewing the facts and what needs to be evaluated, I think following established policies is important, and looking at that situation and investigating any potential fight that James is planning to have with another student. What's going on there? What brought that about? Is that part of the escalating tardies and an uptick in poor decisions from James? And then following up on David's choice to conceal the information rather than making his life a little bit easier by telling the truth. We need to discuss, why did he choose to stay silent, which leads me to point 4. Was it really bullying, or was it a cover-up? Did David ask for the brass knuckles? Did James bring them to David and David has beef with somebody? I don't think that that's the case, but we can't just assume and labeled James as the problem maker without asking some questions of David because of the fact that he was not honest. He did not tell the truth. He wasn't forthcoming with his information. So it puts a big question mark there. Another point is to inform the parents of the district policy, make sure that they're well communicated with, and then proposing possible changes to the policy in the future. So my options and subsequent consequences would be to follow the school policy. Also, contact the alt ed administrator regarding David's status, perhaps as a heads up for a potential bullying target, to keep him safe while he's at the alt ed school, and then pursuing policy change and using administrative help to aid Richard in the decision making. So the pros and cons of these different options with following school policy, I think it establishes very clear, fair practices, and it protects the district from legal action. And then contacting the alt ed administrator to communicate David's status, I think the pro for that is that it would potentially protect David from potential targeting in a hostile environment that he's not familiar with. It would also help us to kind of keep an eye on, is David getting involved in other student groups than what he previously was? And there's more going on with this whole story than what we initially thought. And then pursuing policy change. The pro about this is that it does not affect the current status, but it may help students in the future. So I guess it's a pro and a con. The con is that it doesn't help David in this current situation, but the pro is that it might help students in the future if a policy change is explored. And then using administrative support to aid in the decision making and communicating with the family. This helps to provide some support and authority behind Richard's decision, since he initially decided not to expel David, and now he's having to come back and go ahead and send him to the alt ed school. And involving other parties in that decision will help relieve some of that pressure of making a hard decision from Richard. The pro to that is the help and the colleague support. The con is it may make him seem weak, like he can't follow through on the hard decisions. So the decision that I would make, what I would do is I would follow school policy and go ahead and expel both boys, send them to the alt ed school for 45 days. I believe that this establishes fair practice and it protects the district and Richard from legal action. The other step I would take is to involve my senior principal at the school building, which we have not really heard from, but involve him in the decision, or her, it could be a female, I don't know, and then other people, the SRO officer, perhaps an attorney for the district, and the director of secondary ed, when communicating with the parents in order to communicate the decision, the enforcement of the policy, and why we're doing what we're doing. So in implementing the decision with following school policy and using my administrative supports, I'll talk about the school policy first. I would complete the paperwork as required and communicate. So communicate with the parents, communicate with the principal of the alt ed school to keep an eye on David, and then communicate with the director of secondary ed to make sure that you follow up on that and close that loop so that she knows that you did what she asked you to do. Career-wise, that's just a really important thing. When you have a conflict and a boss is asking you to do something and you're considering whether or not you're going to follow through or not, I think it's important to circle back after you've made your decision and let them know, yes, I decided to go ahead and do the right thing and follow the district policy. And that way your supervisor knows that they can count on you to make the hard decisions and follow through on what you're supposed to do. And then as part of that following school policy is to go ahead and expel James and David, as I mentioned earlier. The second part of that, of implementing my decision, is using those administrative supports to aid in the decision making, involve the SRO and the district attorney and the school principal. And it's possible that at that point, providing a little extra information, if it comes to a juvenile court situation, that the fact that David had no priors will help aid him in any legal trouble he may be in outside of the school's purview. And as I mentioned earlier, this will help communicate to your boss that you're able to make the hard decisions, and the opinion will not fall solely on Richard when communicating with David's mother what the consequences will be. And that is my evaluation of the program, the case study.